One of the main storylines in the parasha this week is the story of the shidduch between Yitzchak and Rivkah, facilitated by Eliezer. We're going to see what Rashi says when it was time for Eliezer to say, all right, Rivkah, let's go meet Yitzchak. And there was some pushback from her family. The way that Rashi explains it raises a number of questions which the Rebbe will address and teach us a fascinating issue with regards to practical halacha. Our parasha talks about the negotiations between Eliezer and Rivkah's family about her impending wedding to Yitzchak. In Rashi's commentary on this give and take, there are a number of things that need our attention. We have to understand how they make sense, in other words, what the message is, and how they actually work in context. So let's begin at the beginning. When the family says to Eliezer, let's call Rivkah v'nisha lo espia, let's ask her opinion about whether or not she wants to go with you. Pirush Rashi, mikan she'ein masin es isha elo midaita. From here we learn that you may not marry a woman without her consent. That's Rashi's comment. It raises a number of questions for us. We have to understand, first of all, in the psukim prior to this conversation, it already tells us, the family had already said, we're good with this. Here's Rivkah, let her be a suitable wife for your master's son, for Yitzchak. Which means that they had already agreed to the shidduch. So if they've already agreed to the shidduch, then in all likelihood when they say let's call the girl and ask her opinion, it's about whether she's ready to go yet, not whether she's ready to go at all. So if you read their words at face value, they're saying let's ask her if she's ready. And Rashi seems to give us a different interpretation, which does not appear to match with the pshat, where Rashi says, let's see if she wants the shidduch at all. Why does Rashi say that? Question 2. After that, when the pasuk says, her brother and her mother said, these are the conditions, Pirush Rashi, what happened to her father? He was there at the beginning of the conversation. So Rashi says that he wanted to prevent the shidduch from going ahead, and so an angel came and killed him, removed him from the picture. The obvious thing that you have to understand from that is, obviously her brother and her mother were not opposed to the shidduch, otherwise they also would have been killed. So clearly it seems like there's an agreement in place for the shidduch, and the family ratifies the agreement, whereas according to Rashi, whereas Rashi is giving us the impression that they were not on board for the shidduch and they actually opposed the shidduch. They said, whoa, let's check what she has to say. In fact, Rashi even makes that comment when Rivkah responds, and he says, Rivkah's answer was, I am going with this man even if you don't want. So Rashi gives an indication that the family was objecting to the shidduch, where the flow of the psukim seems to indicate that they dafka supported the shidduch. So there's obviously a feeling that you get from the way that Rashi puts it, that they were not in favor of the shidduch, and therefore they had to ask her opinion. So something doesn't seem to add up. Why does Rashi feel that the simple version of the Torah is not actually what happened, and that there was pushback from the family? Also, there's another question we have to ask, which kind of looks at things the other way around. Reading the psukim at face value, it looks like the family immediately agreed to the proposal that Eliezer had made, and they were happy for Rivkah to go. As we've already said, they said, they said, here's Rivkah, take her and go. But now, if, as Rashi says, you're not allowed to marry a woman against her will, you can't marry her off to another person against her will without her consent, so kasha meikara, that raises questions in how this whole story worked. Number one, how did the family in the first place say, oh good, we're good with this, go ahead, this shidduch is approved, without having spoken to her? And number two, And the second thing is they said, take her now. That implies that there's no requirement for any preparations. And shortly we're going to see that they said, well, actually we need time. She needs a few months of preparation, in fact a year ideally of preparation in order to go. So this story doesn't seem to match up very well. What is the truth? Was the family in favor of the shidduch, or were they opposed to the shidduch? Do we have to ask a woman's consent, or can we just rely on her family saying, go for it? Did the family agree for her to go immediately, or did they want to hold her back for a period of time? So these are the questions that we have to answer, and in order to answer those questions, we're going to look at the story of the amount of time they wanted for her, which will raise other questions as well, and then once we've done that, we'll be able to answer the whole thing. In the pasuk where the family says to Eliezer, let Rivkah stay with us a period of days, which is euphemistic for a year, or at least 10 months. So Rashi first explains that the word yomim does not just mean days, it actually means a full year. And then he goes, if Moisef Tamna v'kashasam, he explains why this was their argument. Because it is ordinary practice that when a girl who has never been married wants to get married, you give her a year to be able to get together her different ornaments, her jewelry, and so on and so forth for the wedding. So that raises three questions in its own right. Here too we have to understand. Number one, it is self-understood that a girl, especially one who's never been married, needs time to prepare for her wedding, and the child learning Chumash at the age of 5 years old, even he knows that from his own personal experience. And it's quite understandable why the family would say, well, give us a bit of time, let us spend some time with our daughter before we send her off to get married. So the whole thing really makes sense. So why does Rashi feel compelled to explain this to us? Because usually if Rashi explains something, it means that it is not obvious at the face value reading of the pasuk. Well, when I read that a family says, can our daughter spend some time before a wedding, it's self-understood. Why? They don't want to let her go. They want to take some time. They want to get her some jewelry, whatever. Why does Rashi feel the need to explain that this is normal practice and this is what you do for girls before they get married, and they need 12 months? And if you want to tell me that Rashi was not worried about the concept of a girl preparing for her wedding, but rather wanted to address why 12 months, well, by the same logic, then he should have explained why 10 months was an alternative, and he doesn't. So what's bugging Rashi about the fact that the family argues Rivkah should have some time to prepare for the wedding? Question 2. Maybe you'll say, well, it's a case-by-case story. So different girls need different amounts of time to prepare for their wedding. And perhaps what's going on here is that the family turns to Eliezer and says, we've worked it out and we need 12 months. In our circumstances, we need 12 months to get her ready. And that would explain why Eliezer says, no, actually, I have a different cheshbon, and I actually think that she doesn't need any time because there's a whole lot of wealth waiting for her back at home, so she could leave immediately. Rashi seems to indicate that this is not something unique to their case, that Rivkah in her personal status needed 12 months. Rashi says, this is the way you always behave when a girl has to prepare for her wedding. She always needs 12 months. Well, where does he see that in the context of the psukim? It would appear that the context is specifically about this individual case. In fact, on the contrary, according to Rashi's explanation that she needs and that it's normal practice for a girl to have 12 months to prepare for her wedding, why on earth would the family say 12 months or 10? If standard practice is 12, then that's an acceptable value, it's an acceptable period of time. If it is normal practice for a girl to have a full year to prepare for her wedding, why would the family so enthusiastically relinquish 2 of those months without even negotiating? And if 10 months is a good enough period of time for her to get ready, so then why did they ask for 12 months? 10 months is good enough. שגם מזה מוכח שלא היו בזה סדר קבוע, והגבילו הזמן לפי הצורך המשור, בין יופי ומצומצם הדרך שמצינו בתענית אברהם, 50 מהבוים ו50 בגויים. So it implies the fact that they don't have a fixed time period and they're saying it could be 12 months or it could be 10 months, that implies that it isn't a fixed time that we're dealing with over here, it's situational. Very similar to when Avraham Avinu was arguing with Hashem about Sodom. Maybe there's 50 righteous people, maybe there's 40 righteous people, and so on and so forth. So Rashi wants to say, no, actually there's a standard, and this is normal for women before their wedding, particularly women who've never been married before. Where does he get this from? The entire structure of this particular story lends itself to say that it was in these particular circumstances. So this is what we need to understand. Quite a number of factors of the story don't seem to add up. It doesn't seem clear if the family was opposed to or in favor of the shidduch. Certainly Rashi goes with the fact that they were opposed to the shidduch, and that does not seem to be the pshat. Why is it that they want her to stay and he's pushing for her to go now? Why 12 months? Is that fixed? Is that a standard, or is it just situational? So there's quite a number of things we have to understand. To explain all of those things, the Rebbe says, V'habir, the explanation is all based on the following principle. Let's go back to our original pasuk that we quoted, which is where the family says to Eliezer, let's call Rivkah and ask her view as to whether she's ready to go or not. So Rashi's got two choices as to how to explain that. Either they're calling her to say, do you want this marriage? Or they're calling her to say, are you ready to leave yet? So Muchach Rashi lefarish, she'skavnu lichlol es hashidduch. Rashi has no alternative but to say the question at hand is, Rivkah, are you willing to marry this man who you've never met? According to Rashi, it's absolutely clear that this is not a question of do you want to go now or later. It's a question of do you want to go or not go. How's it so clear? Because Rashi says it's quite simple. If the Torah wanted to make this about the time frame when should she go, the Torah would have used a word that implies, do you want to leave now? And it doesn't. It says, do you want to go? Ha-selchi, do you want to go with this man? That, says Rashi, is absolutely clear that it's a question of do you agree to the shidduch or not? If it was a question, do you want to go with this man today, it would have said hayoim, it would have said aton now, or something like that. Oh, now you're going to ask a question. You're going to say, why are you even asking the question? You've already indicated earlier that the family is completely on board. They endorse the shidduch. They're in favor of it. Why are we only asking this question now? So here's the kicker. This is what's going to help us to understand the entire context. It's because something changed. The information that they had at the time, they said, we're in favor of the shidduch. Something had altered that information, and now they began to question the entire shidduch, and in fact felt that it was inappropriate. So we have to understand what caused their shift in thinking. These are the nuances that Rashi points out to help us to understand what changed in their thinking, that they went from being absolutely gung-ho for the Yitzchak Rivkah shidduch and instead now becoming very hesitant and even obstructive. So what changed? Well, if you want to understand what changed, you first have to understand what impressed them in the first place. Why were they so enthusiastic about the shidduch originally? And if we can identify that, we can probably identify what changed about it. So what convinced them? The response of Besuel and Lavan after hearing Eliezer's amazing story, how he traveled a tremendous distance in a single day, got to the well exactly as Rivkah was coming out, made a sign with Hashem, the sign was fulfilled, everything is unbelievable. So they said, this is Hashem's will. It's clearly, it's Hashgacha Pratis, it's Basheret, it's exactly the way Hashem wants. We cannot interfere. And so therefore their attitude was, Rivkah must go with you because this is what Hashem wants. This is what Hashem has said. So they accepted Eliezer's proposal based on their understanding that this was the divine will. And Rashi even says it. He says that their words to Eliezer were, we cannot oppose this. We recognize that this is from Hashem. We recognize it's beyond our control. We recognize that we cannot interfere. So it's pretty clear that based on what Eliezer had told them, they acknowledged that this was divinely guided. Which is why they could not see themselves opposing it. Because they recognize if this is what Hashem wants, we could scream till we're blue in the face. It's going to happen, whether we agree or we don't agree. Whether it happens right now, it happens tomorrow, it happens in a different way, it's going to happen. Once you acknowledge that Hashem is pulling the strings, you know that there's nothing you can do to stop the process. And that's why they agreed immediately without even asking Rivkah. You asked earlier, hang on a second, but you're not allowed to marry off a woman against her will without her consultation. They didn't feel the need for the consultation because it was clear to them that this was a fait accompli. It was going to happen. It's Hashem's will. It is immutable. So therefore, you don't even have to ask her view to know that you agree with this shidduch. So what changed? והנה בהפסוקים של אחרי זה מסופר שבמיינה לדברי אליעזר שלחוני לעדיני אומרו אחי ואימו תשע הנער איתנו יומים או יאסר אחר תלך. Then something happens where Eliezer says, great, so we've got a shidduch, fantastic, send me off. I want to go now, immediately, with Rivkah, let's go. And they pull back and they say, what do you mean? Give us some time, a year or at least 10 months. So basically what they're saying over there is, we agree with the principle, we just need time. But Eliezer doesn't accept that. Eliezer says, no, I don't accept the 12-month waiting period. I have a shlichus. I'm here on a mission. I've got to fulfill my mission. I want to go now. Don't delay me. Now all the red flags go up in the minds of Rivkah's family. And they say, let's call Rivkah and see what she has to say. Now it's not a question about do you want to go now or later. Now something has happened that's made us re-question the entire story. Rivkah, we need to hear your view on this. Which means the last words that Eliezer had said, that pushy statement, I need to go now, don't delay me, that's what caused them to start to sing a different tune. Why? So Rashi explains, when they said, let the girl stay with us for a while, 12 months or at least 10 months, and then she can go, obviously they couldn't argue against the actual shidduch itself because they had said this is God's will and it's going to happen. However, they do have a valid argument to say it is normal practice in the world that you allow the girl 12 months to prepare. We want to invoke that practice. Initially, we were very excited and we thought this is from Hashem, but now that you're pressuring us that she has to go immediately, we're going to pressure back by saying that is not the way people behave. The ordinary way is you allow them 12 months to prepare. More than that. Plus, when Eliezer initially approached the family, he didn't say anything about how soon he was going to take Rivkah. He just said, this is a godly, inspired shidduch. Wow, isn't that beautiful? Hashem brought us together. I came at exactly the right moment. Rivkah fulfilled all the requirements that I'd made in my deal with Hashem. This is clearly divinely inspired. But at that point, he didn't say how soon it should happen. And so in everybody's minds, Lavan and co, they never imagined that he was going to propose taking her immediately. So this is new information. After they had agreed to the shidduch, there's a new bit of information that now Eliezer says, we need to leave immediately. And they say, wait 1 second. Who are you really? What do you really believe? How can we believe anything you've said? But the fact that Eliezer is now opposing normal practice, and he's pushing, don't delay me, and there's nothing about all of what he said, how great the miracles of his arrival and the perfect timing and the divinely ordained meeting between him and Rivkah, none of that says that he has to leave now. So he's introducing a new element to the conversation that he cannot base on the divine nature of this shidduch, and it wasn't thought of, let alone agreed upon beforehand, now suddenly the family says, we don't know if we can trust you. You don't seem to be consistent. When you told us the story initially, it was a very compelling story. Now that you've become so pushy, we start to wonder, who are you? What do you really want? Why are you being so pushy? Why can you not wait the 12 months? In the same way as we believe that the shidduch is ordained and there's nothing we can do to prevent it, surely you should believe that the shidduch is ordained and there's no issue in delaying it. It will happen. Don't worry. It's not like we're going to disappear. So now they start to doubt everything. How do we know that the document you've provided is really from Abraham? How do we know that the miracles that you've described really happened? Maybe you've invented this whole story and you're looking to abduct our daughter. Rashi's already made it very clear that we only know all of these things, the family says, based on what you've told us. There's no external evidence. It's a little bit like, it says here in the note, it's a little bit like the story of the snake with Adam and Chava. Chava said, you're not allowed to touch the tree of knowledge. The snake says, what are you talking about? Pushes her against the tree. See, you touched the tree, you didn't die. Now she doubts the entire instruction from beginning. Who says that if we eat from it, we'll die? Similar kind of thing happening over here. Who says that any of what Eliezer has told us is true? Because he's behaving in an unusual way. So maybe that should cast suspicion on his entire presentation. Because the only reason the family had bought into the shidduch without consulting their daughter was because they were so impressed by the miracles of the story. Now they have to rethink it, because their excitement was based on his report of the miracles. Now that they're not sure that his story is valid, they don't know that they can rely on the miracles, so they have to go back to the default law, which is you cannot marry off a woman without her consent. Call the girl, let's ask her, see what she says. See how the flow works? So Rashi's understanding of the psukim is the shidduch was absolutely on track until one line that Eliezer said that made them jittery, and then nothing was on track. And they said it's all in Rivkah's hands because the rule is you have to ask a woman before you marry her off. Now we can understand why Rashi emphasizes that, of course we know that a woman needs time to prepare for her wedding. But he dafka emphasizes she needs those 12 months because that is the norm. Why? The norm, because that is exactly the purpose of what they're trying to convey to Eliezer. They were not requesting of him, please, if you would kindly allow us the 12 months, we'd appreciate it. They're actually arguing now with Eliezer, and they say to him, because they suddenly recognize that Eliezer is pushing them for something they hadn't originally agreed to, which is to let their daughter go immediately. So now they dig their heels in and they say, no, there are protocols to follow. And those protocols say, number one, you ask the girl first. We haven't done that yet because we were so sold by your story, and now we're not so sold. Number two, even if we agree to it, the normal protocol is she gets 12 months to prepare, and we're not going to rush her off her feet, just like that. But we still have a question. If their entire argument is based on the normal protocol of 12 months preparation time for a new bride, so why were they so quick to say, okay, maybe 10? And the answer to that's quite brilliant. It's got to do with the context in which Eliezer had met and engaged with Rivkah originally. It's quite logical. As Rashi explains to us, the reason that a girl is given 12 months to prepare for her wedding is to be able to gather up the appropriate clothing and specifically jewelry so that she can be beautifully adorned on her wedding day. Now we know in this story that Eliezer very quickly, as soon as the shidduch was agreed upon, produced a whole lot of gold and silver and gave this jewelry to Rivkah. So because Eliezer had already contributed to her jewelry chest, the family had no choice but to backpedal a little bit and say, okay, maybe at least 10 months. In other words, so in other words, they were saying, under normal circumstances, we'd need a full 12 months, but because you've already given her some jewelry, so we calculate that 10 months should now be enough for her to prepare. So in other words, so you'd have to then say that there were two factors that they had to consider. Number one, that Eliezer wasn't giving these as ordinary gifts, but as part of her wedding trove. And secondly, they obviously had to work out that in their calculation, what he had given was the equivalent of 2 months' worth of jewelry. But they were absolutely certain that there needs to be at least a 10-month period before this wedding happens. So now we can understand the logic of what's going on in their minds, and they were not meshuggah, and they were not being difficult. They literally started to doubt Eliezer's story, and as a result of that, they felt that everything should be done by the book. Ask her view, give her time to get her jewelry. But Eliezer was not convinced. And he said, in spite of all of your arguments, I believe we should leave immediately, even according to your logic. He says, look, I know that I was guided by Hashem, so therefore my path is correct. It's true what I'm doing. And to take her back is right. And you don't have to worry about the tachshitin, the jewels that she has to have. Because look, here's a document that shows that Avraham, my master, who's an incredibly wealthy man, has bequeathed everything that he owns to Yitzchak. She will lack for nothing. The reason you want the time is that she should build up her wedding chest. You don't have to worry about it because anything that you'll put together is going to be nothing compared to what Avraham Avinu has waiting on the other side for her. While we're about it, here's another nuance in Rashi. You're going to see that Rashi uses language that is somewhat different to the original source in the Medrash. The original Midrash that Rashi bases his interpretation on says that we are not allowed to marry off an orphan girl without asking for her consent. Rashi changes that and says we may not marry a woman without asking her consent. But we have to understand why Rashi uses different language to his original source. Especially because Rashi chooses the word Isha, which usually refers to an adult woman, and Rivkah at this time was a young woman. According to Rashi, she was only 3 years old. According to other commentaries, she was 14 years old. Either way, she's not an adult. So the term Isha, which is a legal term for an adult woman, doesn't really apply to Rivkah. So why does Rashi deliberately choose the word Isha, which doesn't seem suited to her? So Rashi wants to tell us, yes, on her passport, on her birth certificate, Rivkah may have only been 3 years old, but in maturity, she was like an adult. And we're going to illustrate that from another part of the Torah, and it's going to help us to understand, in the end, an halachic issue, resolve an halachic issue for us. Parshas told us on the pasuk Vayigdala Ne'orim Goyim Pirish Rashi, Kol Zman Shoyiktanim Lo Yonikoyim B'Maseim Ve'ein Adam Medaktek Bohem Mativam. In a couple of weeks' time, when we read Parshas Toldos and we have the birth of the two twins, Yaakov and Esav, so the Torah says Vayigdalu HaNe'orim, when the boys grew up, then you discover that Esav is a field-based hunter and Yaakov is a tent-based student, somebody who's dedicated to the pursuit of Torah. So Rashi says Vayigdalu, only when they grow up. That's the nature of people. You don't really know the nature of somebody until they mature, until they are, so to speak, adult. Then you start to identify what kind of a personality they have. So Rashi points out that once they hit 13, which is the age of majority according to Torah law, so then you started to see the divergence. Yaakov goes off in the pursuit of Torah, and Esav goes in the pursuit of the opposite. The behavior of a mature individual tells us about their character and about the nature of their soul. If a person is intelligent and responsible, then their choices of behavior reflect on their level of responsibility or their level of thinking. But a person's behavior as a child is not necessarily an indicator of what kind of an individual they are. And you often see this. You often see people who as children are very badly behaved and wild and give their parents a lot of grief. And then when they grow up, they become the most beautiful human beings. Because you cannot judge an individual as to their character based on their childhood behavior. It's only once a person starts to mature, then we can say, okay, based on their behavior, we can see what kind of an individual we're dealing with. Which makes us wonder how come when Rashi speaks about Yaakov and Esav, he uses quite a lengthy terminology. He says, as long as they were young, you couldn't recognize through their deeds, and nobody could be specific about their character. What's the difference about the dactic, that anybody could be specific about their character? Why didn't Rashi just say really simply, why doesn't he just really say simply? Once they got to 13, then you started to tell who you're dealing with. Look where he goes, look where he goes. You can tell what type of people you're dealing with. Why does he have to go through this whole thing? Because you don't pay attention to the behavior of children, and from that try and work out their character. Must be because Rashi is trying to teach us something, right? Rashi is hinting at the fact that maybe if you were paying attention, even when Yaakov and Esav were very young, already then you might have picked up on what kind of people we're dealing with. Which means that at face value, the approach that Rashi takes to the Torah, you can ordinarily look at a person and know something about them based on their nature, not only based on their age. Age is not the single factor that determines what kind of an individual this is. For very logical reasons. Some kids mature earlier than others. And so some people you can actually identify their personality and character from a very young age. So 13 is not a magical number that as soon as a person hits 13, suddenly everything is evident and suddenly they mature. It's typical, it's an average. And that usually means that typically from the age of 13 we start to look, because that's when we expect a person's character to take shape. And that's Rashi's point. When a person is a child, we don't pay such close attention to try and see exactly what their character and personality is, because it's not so developed, and in most cases it's not identifiable yet. But the point is, it could be. The point is, there might be individuals who even at a young age are wise beyond their years, mature beyond their age. And that's relevant to our discussion about Rivkah. We know that Eliezer made a deal. He, so to speak, said to Hashem, give me a sign. What was the sign? He made a whole deal. If I ask her for water and she offers not only water for me but for my camels as well, that is the woman that you have indicated is appropriate for Yitzchak. It's very clear from the story of Eliezer that he was medaktek, that he did pay close attention to the behavior and character of the individuals he saw. And when he paid close attention to Rivkah's behavior, he said, this is the one, and he ran towards her with tremendous enthusiasm because he was absolutely convinced that this is who Yitzchak needs to marry. In other words, yes, usually you can't identify the maturity of a person until they get to the age where you start to look. However, there are certain individuals who are ahead of their age. And if you look closely, you discover a maturity about them that ordinary people don't necessarily have. And this is what happens with Rivkah. That's why Rashi Dafka says you don't marry a woman, because this story tells us that Rivkah had the maturity of a woman in spite of her young years. And therefore Rashi can relate the question they wanted to ask Rivkah, are you willing to go with this man, to the principle that says you never push a woman to get married, without her consent. Because Rivkah, leave the halachic side aside, Rivkah from a pshuto shel mikra, simple understanding of the pasuk perspective, is as mature as a grown woman. Now we'll relate this to an halachic issue. We know that Rashi, although it's ostensibly just a commentary that helps to explain the simple understanding of the text, contains magnificent, incredible insights, some of them in the area of halacha, like the one we're about to explore. We all know that 13 is the age where a boy becomes obligated to fulfill mitzvahs. It's called bar mitzvah. Everybody knows this. The question is why? Why 13? There are two opinions. Opinion number one is L'meidim Dovzim Mashakos Vayichul Shnei Bnei Yaakov Shimon veLevi Ishchar Bo veGomer Shahi Bo Azman Bnei Yud Gimel Shana Ukram Akasuv Ish. One argument is because there's evidence in a pasuk that's coming up later. We're going to learn about Shimon and Levi, the two brothers of Dinah, who took their swords and they attacked the city of Shechem. And they were called Ish, they were called adult. And if you calculate it, they were 13 years old at that time. We have evidence in the pasuk that 13 is the age of majority. That's one possible theory. And basically what the Torah would be indicating then is that 13 is a natural threshold. When a person crosses the age of 13, they naturally become mature and, so to speak, intelligent. What's the other view? That this is what's called Halacha Moshe Sinai. It is a tradition that was passed down from Hashem to Moshe at Mount Sinai and has absolutely nothing to do with human nature. Now this has a practical application. We know that for a Jewish person, you hit 13, you become obligated to fulfill the mitzvahs. But what about a person who's a ben noach, a non-Jewish person who wants to fulfill the 7 Noachad laws, as they should? At what age does that individual become obligated to follow the 7 Noachad laws? So, if you go with the first view that says that the Torah tells us 13 is the age of majority, and the reason for it is because that's when you're an ish, that's when you become a mature adult, then any person who's a ben noach becomes equally obligated to fulfill their mitzvahs at the age of 13, because that is a natural age of majority. It's not a Torah-specific law. Because all the Torah is illustrating to us is that this is the age when that natural change happens in a person, and so therefore it doesn't matter whether the person be Jewish or non-Jewish, it's the age of maturity, and 13 would be the time at which a ben noach is obligated to fulfill mitzvahs, the 7 mitzvahs. But according to the other view, which says 13 is an age that was passed down from Sinai and therefore is specific to Jews, then it doesn't have an impact on a ben noach, and a ben noach will become obligated to fulfill his or her mitzvahs relative to their individual state of maturity. And no two bnei noach will necessarily be obligated at the same age. At face value, the Torah was not yet given, so therefore our patriarchs and matriarchs had the halachic status of bnei noach. Now, if you go with the second view, which is that a ben noach becomes obligated to fulfill mitzvahs relative to their personal maturity, which would appear to be Rashi's view as well, then each one is judged individually based on their maturity, as we're seeing here with Rivkah. So then, if that's the case, then when Rashi uses the expression to say you don't marry a woman without her consent, based on the story of Rivkah, he's actually making a powerful halachic statement that because Rivkah technically had the status of Bnei Noach, therefore, in spite of the fact that she was way younger than the typical age of majority, she is considered not only in Pshat, but even in Halacha to have the status of a full adult woman. Why? Because a Ben Noach is determined on their maturity, not on a magical age associated with the average natural maturity of a person.